Ready to explore how business relationships can impact the value of your company?
Ideally, you're forming these relationships just as part of normal business development, kind of understanding if there are opportunities, ways to work together now or in the future.
On this episode of The Gamechangers, I'll be diving in with Chris Lubkert and Artur Grabowski to offer insights that can significantly boost your exit value when you decide to sell your business and help you become more profitable and professional in general on your way to the bottom line.
When I see an acquisition that happened and I didn't even hear about it until it was announced, in almost every case, I just know right off the bat, like that person did not get the valuation they should have.
Chris and Artur are here to share the insights they've gained from working in corporate development teams, both in private equity firms and in software giants like Adobe and Automattic. With such a broad history in acquisitions, these two are probably the most experienced speakers I've had the privilege of interviewing for this series. How is WordPress different when it comes to the acquisition process?
You do have some WordPress companies acquiring and investing outside of WordPress. We did a little bit of that Automattic. We acquired Tumblr, for example. But that's pretty rare. That's the exception. Like in WordPress, when people are thinking about how do I invest, people really tend to look within WordPress. And the reality is that within WordPress, yes, you have tens of thousands of plugins. But if you're talking about scale at all, if you want to look at scale in terms of user base or revenue, that universe is pretty small in WordPress. And for Adobe, the kind of universe of potential acquisition or investment targets was really any software company, whether it's open source, closed source, kind of whatever.
So it seems like you have, quite a broad experience.
Yeah.
What initially brought you into the WordPress ecosystem?
Well, so my move to WordPress, and by WordPress I really mean Automattic, that was my first real foray into the WordPress ecosystem, was actually based on personal dynamics. My wife and I were living in San Francisco. We were leaving San Francisco, and as part of that, joined Automattic, which was this distributed company, work from anywhere, and so could continue working in the software space while living in Ohio. That's where we moved to.
And my entry to WordPress was similar to Arthur's in that joining Automattic was my first experience deep in the WordPress ecosystem. That's where, we had, both a good internal facing opportunities to, kind of learn about Automattic's businesses, but in our role it was also very externally focused, looking across the ecosystem, identifying opportunities. It was a good opportunity to see, get a pretty broad view of the WordPress ecosystem.
Automattic's corporate development team was the context in which Chris and Artur initially connected with one another. And in 2018, fresh out of Automattic, they teamed up to start their own company in the WordPress space. Then, in a sequence of strategic acquisitions of Gutenberg-based web construction tools, they created Extendify. Based on your experience, where does the acquisition process start for buyers? Like, what would be a trigger for a buyer to go out and initiate an acquisition?
At Extendify, we've, all of the acquisitions we've done have been outbound. They've been us reaching out to specific companies, developing relationships with those folks, and kind of completing them, bringing those businesses and in some cases teams on board for to support our broader mission that we're working towards. We oftentimes receive inbound inquiries as well, where people reach out and we evaluate them. This doesn't just go to our spam box. If we're actively looking at acquisition opportunities, but it ends up being just much more rare that one of those ends up happens to be a good fit with what we're doing.
Remember how in our last episode, Marieke van der Acht shared how during her exit, different buyers made extremely different proposals of what should be done with Yoast after acquisition?
I generally think of kind of two types of acquirers. There are financial acquirers and strategic acquirers.
Chris and Arthur's first key point is not only that interested buyers will make bids with entirely different intentions, but that these intentions will deeply impact the outcome of the deal.
If you have an acquirer that's largely a financial buyer and thinks they can buy your business that is generating X dollars of cash flow now and that at whatever price, it'll take them, let's say, 3 years for that to pay itself back. In the meantime, they can grow cash flow, etc. Really, what they're talking about there is, are there, some like maybe revenue growth opportunities, some operational enhancements to optimize cash flow, but they're like really viewing this as like, what's the payback period? Well, how's this going to grow? And then what can I sell it for potentially in a few years? And the real valuation of your business in that case is more strictly defined by standard financial metrics, by comparable transactions of similar companies, etc. If the acquirer is interested in you for very strategic reasons, your product accelerates their roadmap by X years, or your team is really unique and there's no other team like yours in your space. And in that case, you have the opportunity to really separate the valuation from the pure business fundamentals and guide the acquirer to value your business based on the strategic value to their business.
How would I know what kind of buyer to target, strategic or financial?
If you have kind of more of like maybe a generic product, a generic business, you're not number one in your category, etc., but you have 80% EBITDA margins, then a financial acquirer will lean really heavily into something like EBITDA or some metric of financial performance. A strategic acquirer will also look at that, but hopefully, if they're doing their job well, they're kind of, step one is, does this make strategic sense? If so, then let's look at financials, etc. And those financials will inform valuation. What are we willing to pay for this? And it's important, but it won't be like the starting point for an acquisition. The financials won't be.
And then what's the starting point for me as a founder? Like, who should I turn out to?
I'd say that as a starting point for a seller, you need to figure out what you're optimizing for.
As is true for all business exits, the optimization of your exit should be based on what you are looking to gain as a seller. Whether it's max value, finding a new home for your team, or rather staying on board and leveraging your relationship with the buyer to take your company to the next level.
And too often, we do see sellers not talking with enough potential buyers and not having two things. One, kind of enough data points as to what a full valuation might look like. And two, not ending up with competing term sheets so as to be able to negotiate that term sheet.
Maybe I'll just add to that. Like, it's actually quite natural, right? I mean, it can be quite an involved process and uncomfortable for a lot of people to try to sell. Even sales in general can be uncomfortable for some people. But the idea of going out and trying to find a potential buyer for your business, it's not something people have experience with oftentimes. So it's not something they tend to prioritize or want to do. And it's common for people to look, never having even spoken to a particular company, to just look at it from the outside and say, I don't think we're a fit for that company because I don't think it's strategically aligned with what they're doing. Maybe I don't think there's a cultural fit, but have literally never spoken to that company. And you just never know until you actually talk to them, right?
How many then would you say I need to talk to?
It's hard to give an exact answer, but typically it's 5 or more, that you want to talk to in order to make sure you can get to a point where you have a couple different offers at least. So.
And what about being selective about who you turn out to? Because especially if founders are merging into a bigger company, I'm hearing about like tons of developers who are being super cautious about what company and what culture they end up, involved in.
I think the point that Chris was making is sellers go into conversations or never start conversations because they have some notion of what that company or that person or that team is like. It's really hard to know from the outside.
Can you give me like a real life example of how you've seen this play out?
I'll even bring this back to my time at Adobe, where I think if you're in the creative space, for example, Adobe's a cool company and has kind of been one of the major players for a long time, but we were also doing acquisitions of companies that weren't per se creative tools. And so some of these acquirers were talking with us. They may have also been talking with, who knows, like a Facebook or a Google or some other company. But then they would come to see our physical space. We were a physical company. They would come see our physical space, actually see the culture, see what the people are like, and dramatically change their mindset. But they would have never known that if they didn't have that conversation.
Cool. So what's the best time to reach out to potential buyers? And like, at what point, as a founder, what point in my process should I do that? Or are there any time frames determined by buyers that I should aim for?
As we talked about before, if you can develop a relationship ahead of time, before you're at the moment of looking to sell your business, you can that can come with a lot of different benefits.
But then I'm asking myself, how do you reach out to potential buyers if you're so uncertain it would even be a good fit?
If the first time you ever talk to someone is you pick up the phone, or phone not being a likely way to people are going to use, you message someone on Slack and say, hey, I've never spoken to you before, but I'm looking to sell my business. Are you interested? That's hard on both sides. It's hard for you as the seller to understand if this is going to be a good fit for you in the business. It's also hard for the seller, starting from zero, or sorry, the buyer, the potential acquirer, starting from zero and trying to understand, sometimes in a matter of just a couple weeks, is this interesting or not? And oftentimes you might actually get to the answer being no, it's not interesting, but only because we only had a couple weeks to figure out if it was, right? If we had known this business or this company for years, we would potentially be in a very different situation.
So, rather than initiating discussions with people you barely know, taking the risk of outreach being awkward or simply ineffective, the more effective route would be to establish those relationships early on as you build your business. So I kind of get the idea of building a network as you build your business rather than just getting to know people only when you're ready to sell. But can you give me an example of how this works in your case?
Well, for us, when we're reaching out as a potential acquirer, reaching out to another business, whether it's us thinking about a potential acquisition now or just looking to get to know different people better or build relationships, it's all the same. It's oftentimes just, a friendly hello and asking if they're interested in chatting or getting to know each other better. Whether that leads somewhere or not, it doesn't matter in some ways, because there's just kind of like building these friendships and relationships where we can be helpful to each other or potentially work together in some way in the future, but who knows?
As Chris and Arthur have pointed out, you and your potential buyers are likely to have something to contribute to one another way before you're ready to exit. So forming this network in advance is likely to be as beneficial in the present as it may turn out to be in the future. How does this apply to the WordPress ecosystem compared to other markets you've experienced?
Our experience has been that the WordPress community in particular is very open and very welcoming to new people, old people, kind of being helpful in various ways, to people, even if they might even be competitive in some ways. People are helpful with each other. If you're thinking at some point in the future, whether it's in the coming weeks, coming months, or coming years, you're thinking about potentially selling your business, just ping a few folks, and start to chat and share about your business, learn about their priorities and initiatives that they're working on, and try to build that network essentially, so that when the time does come for you to reach out and have a more explicit conversation there, you have some established trust and relationship.
How do you initiate that exactly? Because, I don't know, and I'm sure there are tons of talented shy developers out there intimidated by the idea of creating these, bonds with people that are, currently have nothing to do with.
For the smaller folks, the nature of that relationship is probably like, hey, I'm a product person, you're a product person, like, let's chat, we're doing something relevant, love to hear like your feedback on what I'm doing, etc. If you're talking to a large company that has a corporate development team, etc., I think that's where you really want to make more of a plan for how you reach out to the folks. These larger organizations will have, as we've referred to, a corporate development team that manages acquisitions and in some cases also partnerships. But if you're pretty early if you're at that, as we've been talking about, those early stages, you're maybe a year out from selling your business, etc., then it would make sense for you to spend time with product folks at that company for a couple reasons. One, to really understand what that company's doing so that when you go to sell your business, you can position it the right way. As we kind of mentioned before, ideally your kind of the valuation for your business is based on strategic fit, that it helps this company do this one thing that is the number one priority for that company, and then thus that acquirer will be willing to pay more.
For sellers looking out to max out their financial value, identifying what makes your business stand out for certain buyers may help significantly in negotiating your price and financial terms.
The only way you learn that is by spending time with the product team, maybe with the partnerships team, just really learning what those priorities are. But the second thing is, ideally in the product organization, and again, it's probably going to be in the product organization, you find a champion. You find a person that they themselves take your name to the corporate development team and say like, hey, if these folks are ever for sale, like these are the people that we want, and you want that internal champion to be the one who mentions, hey, your company, XYZ company, and some internal memos like, oh yeah, these folks are doing really cool things. Maybe we partner with them in the future, et cetera, et cetera.
That it does seem like a reasonable route. It also sounds like quite a hassle for a super busy team. Can putting the sale through a broker be a solution for developers not wanting to spend a ton of time networking?
I think where brokers can be helpful is if you are looking for a financial buyer. We've talked about financial versus strategic acquirers. If you're looking for a financial buyer like that, then a lot of brokers have a huge Rolodex and email list and kind of potential buyer list that they can reach out to. And that's where, and having greater exposure to a larger number of potential acquirers can be helpful. If what you're looking for is a more strategic buyer, either because you want a better valuation for your business, you're not interested in just a pure financial view, or you're interested in selling for potentially a different reason, where you're still quite excited about what you're working on, but you think by joining forces you can have a bigger impact and or work with other people that you'd be excited to work with. Your filter probably is narrower, and in that case you probably are able to do it on kind of more on your own if that's what you choose to do. It does take time though, so that's, as Arthur talked about, the pros and cons of different approaches, like putting all the materials together, responding to all the follow-ups, reaching out, all of that takes energy. So if that's not time you have to spend, then that's another reason why potentially engaging with a broker or someone to help you through the process could help.
Again, there are pros and cons to every path you take to selling your business, including whether you use like a broker or someone to help you with that process. But the thing that you do risk if you just work with someone who's going to like create a standard set of materials for you and then just blast it out to everyone, the same exact thing with the same email, the same time, whatever, is that message isn't going to come across. And what that acquirer is going to do, like what Chris and I do if we get one of these, is we kind of end up like undoing what that broker did, like deconstructing it and trying to figure out what's actually there. And really, like, we're having to do all the legwork of figuring out, like, is there a fit here? Because the seller didn't do that. The seller sent us really just like a boilerplate type set of information.
So say we have a few people expressing interest in the founder's product, or a few people likely to be interested. How exactly would I present them with the opportunity?
If you knew that, let's say you're an e-commerce business, and you're considering a sale to a potential host, and you know that host doesn't actually want to own a bunch of disparate WooCommerce plugins, extensions. What they really want to do is they want to build out, a better e-commerce experience for their user base. Then what you should be talking about in those conversations is your team's experience, your ability to accelerate their roadmap. You should not be talking about how wonderful, plugin number 32 is. If you're talking to someone else who, what they actually have is the suite of different products, and they're really interested in cross-promoting relevant solutions, then you should be talking about how relevant your user base is.
Even at Adobe, we would acquire a product that actually does have revenue, and day one after the acquisition, we would make it free. The seller, through the conversations, if they did their job and really understood what we were interested in, then through the sale process, they wouldn't be telling us, like, oh, look, our cash flow is great. Oh, our revenue is going to grow 25%, is going to XYZ, because we're just like, we don't care. Like, we're turning it off.
And how would I know what their focus is without being too direct?
I think being direct can be good in many cases. So one question you could ask if you're talking to the head of a particular division or the product leader for within some large organization, you can ask them quite directly, like, what's your focus over the next year? If you find yourself in a position where you're kind of already talking to someone about a potential acquisition and you still don't understand why, you don't actually know, is it because of the X dollars of cash flow that you have, or is it because of the X thousand users you have, or is it because of the 10 people on your team, or whatever it is? I think it's still fair to ask.
And when discussing the cases in which max value is not the priority, your considerations in selecting an acquirer may become so complex, getting to know them is crucial to determine if there's even a proper fit.
Because any of these conversations, especially if you and or the team are staying on, it should be a two-way evaluation, right? It very much is the buyer evaluating if the company is a good fit for them, but also it should be the other way around as well, where you as the seller are trying to understand what is it going to be like in this new organization, what are we going to be working on, making sure there is this strategic alignment and good fit there so that it'll be successful even post the deal closing.
Before we wrap things up, from your perspective, you'd probably agree with me that with all the recent acquisitions, WordPress, as we know it, is changing. Would you say that the consolidation is benefiting investors over founders or vice versa?
I feel like there's been a shift over the past couple of years where now the environment, I would say, leans more towards favoring sellers currently. It seems like there's a fair amount of interest. Still, as I mentioned, confined to the WordPress ecosystem of typically where there are potential acquirers, but it's a hot market, I would say. And so, especially in areas of e-commerce or other kind of sections within WordPress that have seen a lot of growth over the past year and a half, and they're seeing a lot of demand there. When we were at Automattic, there seemed to be fewer potential acquirers. So, in some ways it made our job easier in that, there was an opportunity to form a connection with a business, identify how we could potentially work together. And oftentimes it made a lot of sense for us to join forces and was exciting for both sides. Now, since leaving Automattic, a lot of folks have reached out as they consider their own future of their business. And so we've supported folks from the other side a little bit, kind of sharing some guidance and things that we've learned from our experience. And there's more choice that sellers have.
Considering your experience and how things work in various markets, where do you see WordPress going from here?
When WordPress companies are looking to sell their business, they almost always sell to another WordPress business, right? Is that like, Arthur, I can't think of, it's either a host or another WordPress specific company. Mm-hmm. Which may change over time. I mean, you think as WordPress continues to grow and as companies within WordPress continue to gain more scale, I mean, something like the events calendar, like there are other acquirers in that niche that, they could have explored and perhaps did, but, everything from Ticketmaster to, other companies like that. If you think about like GiveWP, they were acquired by Liquid Web as well. And, but there are other online donation platforms that could have looked at that solution and thought, this is a good opportunity for us to get into the WordPress space with a relevant product. So I don't really know what's driving that, but I could see an opportunity, to really think more broadly beyond the WordPress ecosystem, specifically on where there might be a potential fit.
If you like this video, stay tuned for the upcoming episodes of The Gamechangers.
mission, there's no mission. The mission is to cut down the amount of shit that you need to do in life that you don't like.
It's not, oh, I just changed who signs my check, but I'm still doing exactly the same job. The job does change a little bit because you get access to a broader set of resources.